Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio as we wave goodbye to July and head into the second month of our summer in Central Virginia. Joining us now, Senior Vice President of the Capital Research Center, Great Policy Brief, The Economic Situation. Bruce Yandle is on with us. Bruce, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you, sir?
Good, Joe. Delighted to speak with you today.
Well, your policy brief is not a cheery one. I'm glad to hear you're more cheerful than our economic outlook. Is this a situation that we're going to have to go through a long, bumpy period, or can there be a quick fix without making things worse in the future?
I don't think there's a quick fix. And nor do I think that we are going to be hitting some really deep negative numbers on real GDP growth. I think we're going to be bouncing around when measured in real GDP growth, bouncing around low negative numbers and occasionally hitting positive numbers. I'm speaking of quarterly readings on real GDP. I don't think that we're going to have anything that would compare with what we now call the Great Recession, 2007, 2008. But there are a lot of moving parts to this puzzle. There always are, and this particular one right now, I think, is a little bit strange relative to what we have faced in the past.
Is the zeal of our elected representatives to avoid the R word, as you said, the recession, going to lead to chasing policy to try to avoid it, Federal Reserve, interest rates that can all wind up being to the detriment of the lower income earning people in the United States and Virginia?
They will be bearing the burden. They already are. That is, when we look at inflation numbers exceeding 8% as measured by the CPI, and then when we look at average gains in wages at 5.3%, then that average wage earner is losing ground at a pretty good pace. And so those who are least able to escape the burden are going to get hit with it. The part of this puzzle, though, Joe, that I think is truly troubling is reminiscent of that old song from the 50s, Pennies from Heaven. Every time it rains, we get pennies from heaven. Our politicians attempt to cover problems that sometimes they generate, sometimes the world generates, but they try to cover those problems by sending us some checks in the mail, pennies from heaven. And it feels good. Any one of us that happens to open our bank account and see that a direct deposit has been made by the federal government into our checking account or by some other means, of course it feels good. But there are no good new goods and services produced in association with those new dollars. And in a sense, that's our fundamental problem, that we've got high inflation, and the high inflation is due partly, not totally, but partly by printed money that has been sent, the pennies from heaven. Then we fold into it Russia, Ukraine, COVID, other kinds of issues, and then people start talking about supply chain problems. But our main supply chain problem, I would suggest, is that we have a fully employed economy. A lot of folks have decided they no longer want to work or need to work. We have a fully employed economy, and we still have pennies from heaven. There are folks out there wanting to buy a new pickup truck, and there are not any on the lot. Or they want to add a room onto the house or a new deck, and the price of lumber is pretty high. It is getting better. But the pennies from heaven tend to be the source of our pleasure, and I would say our problem, and then it's up to the poor old Fed to try to figure out how do we slow this thing down and change the outcome.
When you talk about the pennies from heaven, and we just saw a report, one watchdog group has found upwards of $40 million in ARPA money, American Rescue Plan Act money, that was sent just to the municipality of the city of Richmond has gone missing. They can't go back and figure out who it was given to, what expenditures it was made for. They were just either spent or distributed to folks. And the listeners are understandably upset because this is all part and parcel of what is driving the economic increase, the devalued dollar. And that's just one of thousands of municipalities in Virginia that some might be better, some might be worse. And that pennies from heaven is vanishing at a breakneck pace. It's not like it's all getting to the intended targets. A lot of it is disappearing into these rabbit holes, Bruce.
That's right. I mean, there is that lack of accountability or the inability to account, and part of that may have to do with the large volume of dollars that we're talking about. Something that is somewhat related tangentially to what you were speaking about for Virginia. I think there are about 14 states now, maybe the number is creeping up, that have announced that they're going to be sending purchasing power to their state citizens to try to offset the price of gasoline. And it's easy for states to do that and for municipalities because cash balances are large as a result of the past stimulus spending. There's a lot of money sitting in bank accounts across public units as well as across all consumers. Cash balances are high. And so those cash balances are getting moved around by states and then by municipalities in an attempt to try to offset some of the pain that people are feeling. And the reason that I think it's important for us to be aware of that is that anything that quickens the pace of money moving through the economy raises the prospect for more inflation, which then makes the Fed's job a little more challenging, which then suggests that the next time they meet, they'll be entertaining another 75 basis point increase, and that as they contemplate the future, they may be looking 2 percentage points added on to interest rates. So pennies from heaven, less accountability as to how the money is being spent, yields the prospects for another little dose of inflation, making it more difficult and more challenging for the Fed to attempt to offset that inflation. And I think that's part of the difficult challenge being faced right now. And the Fed, in a sense, is the only game in town, the mop-up crew, you might call them, having to try to offset the behavior of the politicians who want to send us pennies from heaven, which we welcome when they arrive.
Now, in your policy brief, which is available through Mercatus.org, and you talk about a few very dark clouds in the otherwise sunny outlook, and if we can get back to free market policies. But my concern is that we've seen since novel coronavirus entered our vernacular that we are becoming more and more apt to, at least municipally, overreact to things. Is there a concern that when we get these really dark clouds coming in, there could be an overreaction or an overcorrection of things that could make things worse economically?
I think there is, and it seems, I would say, more so with the current administration than in several recent administrations. Everything tends to be described as a crisis. The word crisis shows up frequently. That is, when you go to whitehouse.gov and go to the website of the White House and read statements that have been made by the president, executive orders that have been written on various issues, almost in the first paragraph is, we face a serious crisis in this nation. And the crisis may be gasoline prices, the crisis may be carbon emissions, on and on, but everything is described in terms of crisis. when you get a crisis, it's understandable, given our language and our emotions as human beings, that there's an expectation that there be a heavy response if it's truly a crisis. Bring out the big guns, bring out the big action, write more executive orders, ask for more use of emergency powers. And I think that what you are suggesting is indeed part of our current culture. That we become accustomed as individuals, as citizens, to hearing a crisis every night when we turn on the 6 o'clock news as a new one, and then there's an expectation that there's going to be something going on in the Rose Garden addressing this most current crisis.
Right.
We don't seem to have any particular reliance these days on a notion of fundamental principles, of saying, let's take a look at this market economy that we have, which is heavily affected by government's hand, but let's look at this market economy and see how the economy itself may be adjusting to a situation. For example, Joe, there's an old saying, I know you've heard it many times, that the cure for high prices is high prices. When the price goes up on something that we all treasure and want, it signals to the world that we do want more of it. And that price signal is typically going to induce more supply in the future so that prices can go down. Mm-hmm. If we take an action to disguise the politically induced scarcity of petroleum and gasoline by saying we're going to try to disguise this so our good consumers won't have to bear the burden, then we won't have to bear the burden and we'll keep on driving as though the price hasn't gone up. And so that makes the problem a little bit worse. Mm-hmm. As opposed to saying, this is tough, folks, but bear with it. Let's see if we can get the supply side freed up over here. Let's remove some regulations, perhaps, that will get some more energy flowing and give the market a chance to respond. But we don't hear much talk about the market process as being our friend.
No.
It's more often described as an enemy that has to be countered by government forces.
You mentioned petroleum right there. You have government officials who are lauding the confiscatory prices that people are struggling even to get to work under because it will help us usher in some brave new future with horribly polluting solar cells and horribly polluting batteries that will charge our electric cars until we have to dispose on them. And I guess then we'll have another climate crisis that we'll have to figure out what to do with the disused solar cells and Tesla batteries.
That's right. It may be laying the foundation for another one, but in the current environment, we have become accustomed in the last 3 years with COVID to talk about supply chain problems. And now that gets to be sort of a stock response to anything that shows up that is communicating scarcity. But when you look at the unemployment rate for the state of Virginia in June of 2.8%.
Yes, sir.
Back in the old days, people would call that being fully employed.
Overheated almost. I remember some years ago somebody told me anything under 5 is overheating the economy.
That's right, and so I would say that I would not call that a supply chain problem. When people say, why is it that when I try to go and buy something or add a room onto the house or trade cars, that the warehouse is empty, seems like a supply chain problem. And my response is, well, that's a good way of putting it, but you are also talking about a fully employed economy. Mm-hmm. And granted that there are some people who are work age who've chosen to no longer participate in the economy, but that's what freedom is about. Mm-hmm. People make decisions based on what they perceive to be in their best interests, And now we're looking at this incredibly low unemployment rate while we are still out there shopping with pennies from heaven.
Right. Well, and let me because I really want to talk about China and its impact on this, but I want to talk about supply side, because there's been some very learned columns written here in Virginia encouraging the governor to do more supply side reforms. We see when the consumer price index comes out at 9.1% year over year increase, the producer price index is 10.2% year over year, which means these producers are actually getting squeezed harder than the consumers are in the increase in costs. What do we need to do on the supply side, Dr. Yandle, to fix some of this? Because I really feel like that's where our problem is, and maybe that does tie into China and their ability to produce things so much less expensively.
I think we certainly should be focusing on the supply side in very real, I would say, commonsensical ways. It's not rocket science. My mind goes back, Joe, to the time when Richard Nixon leaves office. Mm-hmm. President Ford comes in. He calls himself the accidental president. I was alive and well at that particular time in history, and I remember well that one of the things Mr. Ford did was to say the first thing we want to do is to hold hearings and conversations across the entire country. Major cities, every state, multiple locations. We want to figure out how we can get this economy going again. And there were serious problems with inflation then, very similar to what we have now. There were problems with embargoes on Russian products, very similar to what we have now, and an invasion in countries that were parallel to Russia. So there were a lot of similarities when we look back, but then there was this series of conversations. I participated in one of those conversations and then later went and worked in the Ford administration. But out of the conversations came a number of things, but a chief concern was federal regulation that made it more difficult for people to respond to a stimulus to produce more. Let's look long and hard at regulation, and let's see if we can't get the burden of government itself to be lighter. Mm-hmm. It's not so much that we need to find ways for government to deal with problems. It's how we choose to deal with the problems that matters. And so we have had a tendency in this country, still have, to use command and control regulation, for example. Technology specified, highly specific ways. Each and every firm will do it this way or you will be in trouble. Instead of saying what matters is the outcome, we're going to have a performance standard and we don't care how you go about getting there. We'll let competition figure it out, but we'll hold your feet to the fire in terms of outcomes. And so it was during the Ford administration that for the first time, the White House established a mechanism for reviewing newly proposed regulations from executive branch agencies and then placing a little more insistence that consideration be given to benefits and costs and making regulations more cost-effective. That process got rooted and it continued on into the present, but we need to refresh it. Mm-hmm. We need to take that second look, just as we did back then, and almost have a contest across governments to see how we can go about achieving the goals of government that are in place in different ways, and let this federal system come to our advantage instead of relying almost totally on national guidance, encouraging performance. Look at outcomes, not how you're going to regulate, trying to free up the free spirit of man and the creative spirit of people and get that back, turning out more goods and services. I think it's crucial that we take that hard look. It sort of goes against the grain right now when we have a crisis mentality that also generates a mentality that says we need to put another policeman on We need to write more rules instead of fewer.
Has the bureaucracy in Washington gotten to a point where big companies can use their ability to deal with that regulatory capture better than a small upstart competitor, and that is at very least dampening any ability to innovate?
That surely is the case. I think we could probably point to many specific instances where that is just the case, Joe. Prior to the rise of federal regulation, and I'm speaking in current history, and I would say the 1970s represent a watershed in terms of a shift to federal regulation away from state and local regulatory approaches. But prior to that, we had a much more competitive picture in terms of trying to accomplish different things in different states, different cities, using different approaches, different rules, and relying on common law as a fundamental mechanism for dealing with problems that people faced, particularly with the environment, for example.
Oh, yeah.
No one has the right to discharge waste into the river that washes my land, that causes my property to be affected. Mm-hmm. That's a common law rule. I have the power to bring an action against that upstream polluter. And we had that going on. But as you point out, in many arenas, it was much more cost-effective for a large corporation that is national in scope to lobby one government in Washington than to try to lobby and influence 50 governments in each state capital. And so there came to be a preference for one set of rules and command and control, particularly if you pick the way I do things and impose that on my competitors.
Yeah.
You know, that won't cost me anything because I'm already doing it. But, hey, how about requiring everybody that produces an automobile to put a catalytic converter on their automobiles? By the way, I have the patent on them, and they already own my automobiles. So make everybody else put on a catalytic converter, even Honda, which at the time had a clean burn engine that didn't need any kind of emission control device. Well, we put one on their cars too. So the theory that I have peddled for quite some time of bootleggers and Baptists. Mm-hmm. Both are strange bedfellows, and they both like the same outcome in a traditional sense. The bootleggers like laws that shut down the liquor stores on Sundays, eliminating competition, and the Baptists like those rules too.
Exactly.
And the bootlegger can rely on the Baptists to go down and lobby the state government to make sure that the laws are enforced. Don't let those liquor stores open. And the bootlegger says, and I might even make a contribution to people running for office occasionally myself. But so we get this bootlegger Baptist phenomenon, and we sort of get it in spades as we shift from local, from state to federal, and then to more uniform ways of trying to regulate outcomes.
Economically, and we only have a minute left, so maybe I shouldn't open this Pandora's box and just hope that we can have Professor Yandle back. He's there at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I guess with only a little bit time left, what are you working on right now, Professor? Are you just giving some talks about your economic forecast?
Well, as a matter of fact, Joe, I'm in the midst of developing the content for my next economic situation report, which will show up. The world will see it on September 1st. Okay. But the content for that report is sort of in the cookie dough stage right now, and I'm in the kitchen.
Yeah,
so I'm trying to get a better handle on what we can expect in terms of our national economy's performance over the next 6 months to 1 year. I made reference to that in our opening remarks at the very outset, and that's what I'm trying to get a handle on right now. And I think maybe we can at least end on a little bit of a positive note in the sense that as I look at the data and as I try to get a feel for the pulse and I look at other organizations' forecasts, what I see is a slowing economy that is bouncing around on a bottom in a sense with slow growth, negative growth, but not a serious disturbance that would cause us to think here comes another great recession.
Well, that's good to hear.
What I wish I could see more of would be statements from national leaders, our elected officials, saying this country has a market economy that is still functioning. Let's look a little more closely. Let's listen more closely. Let's give the market a chance to respond to some of these problems and see what kind of outcome we might get when free markets are allowed to work a little more freely.
Well, thank you so much for your time, sir, and we'll look forward to. I've just sent our producer say we have to have him back in September at the very least. Professor Yandle, Mercatus.org. Read all about it, as they used to say in the newspaper business. And thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And thank you all for tuning in and joining us. Until next weekend, on behalf of everyone here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.